Sony just scheduled an event for May the 23rd at 10 a.m. in the morning, and that's Toronto or New York time. Are we getting the much anticipated Sony A9 III? Or what about the Sony A7S IV? Or perhaps could this be a new vlogging camera, such as a refresh of the ZV-1, the ZV-E10, or something completely different? Well, stick around after this short break as I get into the details. But first, please do me a favor and follow me on Twitter. But most importantly, please subscribe to this channel. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really does help this channel grow. And thanks to your support, this channel just reached 40K. Sony just got over announcing the ZV-E1, a full-frame vlogging camera with essentially the same capabilities as the Sony A7S III, which is performing well in some markets, despite some of us being a little bit confused by this camera. Well, just a few hours ago, Sony scheduled an event on YouTube for a new vlogging camera to be announced May the 23rd at 10 a.m. in the morning, Toronto and New York time. Well, that's just a week away. Next Tuesday at 10 a.m. in the morning, we have a new Sony vlogging camera. Now, is this going to be a completely new model, or will it be a refresh? The ZV-E10, after all, has been out for about 2 years. And the ZV-1, their first, well, I call it their first modern vlogging camera. The ZV-1, well, it's been out for about 3 years now. So I think if we're going to get a refresh of one of the current vlogging cameras, I definitely think it's going to be the ZV-1. I was almost going to say ZV-E1. Let's take a look at the current specs of the ZV-1. It has a 20.1 megapixel sensor, and it's backside illuminated. It's not stacked. It comes with a 24-70 Zeiss with an f1.8 to 2.8 lens. Video is capped at 4K 30 frames per second, although it does have H-Log, S-Log2, and S-Log3. And of course, being a vlogging camera, it does have a 3-inch flippy screen. Obviously, it's going to have some real-time tracking, eye autofocus, all that stuff works really well. Face detection, eye detection, and what I really like about Sony cameras is the ability to adjust the exposure if you're going from light to dark, so that's also really handy as well. And this camera currently sells for $748. But let's take a look at the ZV-E10 to compare and contrast. It has a 24.2 megapixel sensor. It's also APS-C, but this one isn't backside illuminated. It also has a 3-inch flippy screen, and video, well, it's capable of 4K up to 30 frames per second, but in full HD, we get 120 frames per second. It's got the exact same autofocus system, got the exact same LCD, and in terms of still shooting, it can shoot at 11 frames per second and has a pretty good ISO range of between 100 and 32,000. So that kind of gives you a baseline of what we could expect from this vlogging camera if it is a refresh of the ZV-1, or even if it's a refresh of the ZV-E10. But I'm really curious to know what the actual specifications are. We don't have any leaked specifications for this camera, but I think I've got an idea for you. Let me go ahead and flash up the Canon R50, because this camera was announced not too long ago, and it sells for right around the same price point as we'd expect to see a successor of the Sony ZV-1. And, well, based on the current price, the Canon EOS R50 is selling for $679, which is $100 less than the Sony ZV-1 at $748. But taking a look at the specs of the Canon EOS R50, and yes, this isn't exactly a vlogging camera, but we're trying to establish a target state, a forecast of what we think this vlogging camera could have. And despite this being a new camera, we see it as 24.2 megapixels, which is an improvement over 20.1 on the ZV-1, but it's not a huge amount, and I really wouldn't expect to see the megapixels, the resolution, being much higher than 24.2. In terms of video, this also caps out at 4K 30 frames per second, although it does 6K oversampled 4K, so we do get more detail. It's got a very fast image processor. It's got Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is right up there with Sony, but take a look at the electronic shutter. 15 frames per second, which is a definite improvement over 11 frames per second. And of course, Canon's also got a 3-inch flippy screen. So does that help you establish what we could potentially see in the Sony ZV-1 successor? Well, not really, not to me, because I don't see a huge difference between the Canon R50 based on specs and based on what we might expect to see from the ZV-1. However, I do have a few thoughts. I certainly think it's plausible to keep this camera at 4K 30 frames per second. It would be nice to go to 4K 60, and definitely do 120 frames per second in 1080 also makes sense. Delivering oversampled video, if this goes up to 24 megapixels, then that gives it 6K oversampled 4K, and to me, well, that's a really big deal. Now, Canon can do it in their R50, And Sony's known for doing oversampling, so I wouldn't be surprised to see 6K oversample 4K. I know we're not going to get dual UHS-2 card slots, but I wonder, what could Sony tweak here? Could they give us a stack sensor? No, I think that's unlikely for a camera at this price point. Now, the first one was a backside illuminated, but if we take a look at the ZV-E10, not backside illuminated, I'm really not too sure what Sony's going to do here. I'm also not sure what they're going to put in this camera in terms of an image processor. What could Sony do to make this camera better? Well, even if they keep the specs very similar to the R50 or the ZV-E10 or even the ZV-1, one thing they could do to really improve upon the camera is add more computational capabilities, to add more, well, capabilities that make this camera easier to use, that improve our workflow. And I think that would make a huge difference with this camera. They could increase the frame rate from around 11 frames per second to 15, or even go up to something a little bit higher, such as 18 or 20 frames per second. After all, if we just spend a few $100s more, the Canon EOS, what is it, the R10, which is below the R7 in terms of cost and capabilities, that camera, when it goes on sale, sometimes goes on sale for $849, and it can shoot up to, what is it, 30 frames per second? So you get considerably more, much faster, although the buffer does cap out. But you're buying this camera for one of two things, for video or stills, and considering it's a vlogging camera, who's kidding who, you're buying this camera primarily for the vlogging capabilities. And as I said in the intro, one thing I think that Sony does very, very well is the ability not only to track the subject, to autofocus on that subject with their eyes, face detection, but also to automatically adjust the exposure. I wish Canon had that capability. I think that really makes an improvement. And yes, you're not going to work miracles, but if you're changing lighting conditions, to have that camera to automatically say, okay, look, I get it. Your big head is taking up most of the frame here, so we're going to lock onto your eyes. Why not expose properly for the face? It makes an awful lot of sense. And of course, having the right lens on there also makes a huge difference, providing more detail. There's no sense doing 6K oversample 4K up to 30 frames per second, or perhaps, and yes, I do understand that there is a chance they could push it up to 50 and 60 frames per second, but will they do that? It's all about providing us better results, and if we have a lens that's better, more sharper, be able to provide us with more detail, then that 6K oversample 4K makes a huge difference. S-Log2, S-Log3, HLG, well, those are features you don't normally expect to see in a camera at this price point, and that alone is one of the reasons I'd expect to see this camera priced a little bit more than the Canon EOS R50. But keep in mind, using S-Log2 and S-Log3, they aren't exactly entry-level features, and it can take for somebody who's never dealt with log footage, it can take a little bit of getting used to. And you've got the luminance, and then you've got the color space, and doing all that. If Sony could somehow have computational photography that would somehow do all that in camera and make it just come out really, really good, so that the person doesn't have to, that you as somebody looking at buying this camera doesn't have to make any changes, that would be a huge deal. I've been shooting log footage since I got the Canon EOS R5, and I got to tell you, it took me a while to get to the point where I understand how to play around with the luminance and, of course, the color space to get everything to pop perfectly. And, of course, there's also that white balancing, right? So if Sony in the ZV-1 successor, if that's what we're getting, can add some more ease of use features, computational photography into video, that allows us to take the autofocus, allows us to take exposure controls, and allows us to take that log footage and be able to deliver a result where the person behind the camera really doesn't have to do anything other than just to frame things up and to give us even better image stabilization, then I think Sony would have a big winner here. They don't have to go 4K 120. They don't have to do all that crazy stuff that we see in cameras much more expensive, such as the ZV-E1. What do you think? What do you think are the capabilities of this new camera that's going to be announced? And is it going to be an absolutely new camera, a completely new camera, or will it be a successor to the ZV-1 or the ZV-E10? Let me know in the comments section down below. And if you want to pre-order this camera as soon as it's available, I already have smart pre-order links in the description down below, as well as right here. And if you click on those, they're not going to work right now, but as soon as the pre-orders are available, whether you shop at Adorama or B&H, then what's going to happen is they'll refresh. And what I like about my smart pre-order links is they won't just give you a pre-order link to one camera, it'll give you every sort of kit form. So if Adorama or B&H, as you can see right now, look at all the different kit forms they have. Yes, it's got the same lens, but there's different packages, and what this will show you is all the different packages. So instead of hunting and searching, you can be one of the first to pre-order this camera using these smart pre-order links. And if you want to stay up to date on all the latest camera news and rumors, such as when we get the leaked specifications and also the identity of this camera, well, then go ahead and subscribe, but make sure you choose all notifications. And for all those minor news and rumors out there, ones that aren't quite big enough to have their own separate video, well, then go ahead and follow me on Twitter at this address here. Quite often I cover a lot of videos, or I cover a lot of news and rumors or price discounts, and there's been an awful lot of price discounts on right now. And what I quite often do is I'll tweet that out. They're not big enough to have their own separate video, so go ahead and follow me on Twitter if you want to stay up to date on all the major and minor news and rumors, as well as price discounts. But that's it for now. Have yourself a great, what is it today? Monday, Tuesday? Yes, Tuesday. I took the day off to take my son to track and field, and while he was doing all the running around, boy, was it exhausting. Carrying all that camera gear with me, I was just beat. I'm so glad to be home, relaxing, and yes, I do consider this to be relaxing. So have yourself a great week. We'll see you again soon. Thanks so much for watching.